Welcome back to Accessible Intelligence, or welcome to Accessible Intelligence, where we are giving a realistic take on all things artificial intelligence. Since this is our first episode, let's just quickly introduce everybody. We have a pass the mic situation that will hopefully be smoothly edited, or as smoothly edited as I want it to be, so just bear with that. But Megan, go.
Hello, everyone. I'm Megan. I just finished a master's in technology policy, and I run a social media account called Gen Z Bestie, where I talk about all things tech, AI, and what's generally changing the world. And I joined this podcast because I'm really interested about talking about all things tech and what is interesting in this space right now.
Hello, my name is Austin. I graduated a year ago, got a job in corporate, and it was not what I wanted to be doing. And so I've kind of, started experimenting with AI in terms of my job. It was like forced upon me. But since then, I've been trying to experiment with it. What I want to do is foreign policy. So try to see how I can use AI to really get into a field that I think is one of the most gatekept or most high barrier to entry. So been really experimenting with that in different formats.
Hi, I'm Hillary. I also graduated a year ago. Have not since gone on to pursue a master's. Basically got started with really thinking about AI kind of as a hobby. I was someone who loved being in school, loved that institutionalized opportunity for learning. And I think post-grad, I was seeking that. And I really found a topic that I was really interested in with AI, in the sense that it creates an entirely new social experience. It's an entirely new, digital kind of reality. And I just love thinking about everything that it represents and what it means for our society, our relationships, all of that. So really been pursuing this topic as an interest, been keeping up a Substack called Scaffold, where it's kind of my repository for a lot of different things, AI, critical thinking, education related. But a key thing I've been doing is interviewing a lot of my friends and just hearing their perspectives and really platforming everyday perspectives on this technology that's supposedly transforming our lives.
Yeah, we all got the invite for the interview.
Yeah,
so
basically.
That was a good check for us. And I'm Sam. I'm a podcast producer, and I create content for brands, mainly Notion, which is a productivity tool. And I'm doing this podcast because I like doing podcasts, clearly, but also because I think informally we've been talking about AI stuff for a while now. And this is the next step to whoever also might be interested to tune into our thoughts. So let's get into this group, Accessible Intelligence, and what we're trying to achieve. So something that we've been talking about is that a lot of the AI-focused content out there these days is very much forward-looking expert opinions. They're either from very technical experts, or they're overly cynical, or they're overly hyped content. And we feel like there's a gap for a podcast in this content that tracks recent, as in the past year, AI developments from a user perspective, and creating that recent timeline, a year to a few years, about how AI is actually being used and experienced by regular people. So I'll just put the first question out to the group, but what does all of that mean to you? Why does this podcast format and content have the potential to work, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think something that's been my main goal with my social media account has specifically been breaking down topics in AI without all that jargon and fluff. And I think when it comes to AI, a lot of the times the conversations are not very accessible. We're talking about how people in corporate are using AI and how that's driving revenue growth. But when it comes to how AI is actually impacting people in their day-to-day, that's often a conversation that we have felt is very left out and not talked about enough. And so that was a major motivation for what we wanted to do with this podcast.
Yeah, and I think we really looked around the ecosystem and saw that I think what the world needed was one more podcast. It was missing out on it. But yeah, we were talking about it. I think we've had, I think us two at least have been on Sam's podcast before. And when we were there, one of the big things we were talking about is exactly young professionals in the workforce and experiencing this AI disruption. And I think the lesson we got from that is that everyone will need to know how to use AI at some level to kind of differentiate yourself or to get ahead, especially if there are layoffs and less jobs because of it, especially entry level. And you said, the most of the content out there is from expert opinions, because really that's what you would want to listen to, is an expert opinion. Who else would you want to listen to? But I think when you listen to that on, this great podcasts, I think they're very interesting. You get a lot of maybe theoretical knowledge and knowing how it works or what it means. But when you leave, you don't really know what to do with it, because either they're talking about something that's unreleased, or they're talking about, building your own LLM model. Not LLM, building your own LLM. Yeah, that vast majority of people will never do that. So I think what kind of is unique here is that we all experiment with AI in some way. And so at least to some level, we can, we have takeaways, or we have thoughts, or we have, we've tried before. So I think it's a much more accessible angle.
To make what both of you said a bit more concrete, can everyone think of an AI publication or podcast or any type of content or creator that they feel like does a good job, and talk about our podcast in reference to that? So for example, like this is pretty common, I think, in podcast strategy, where it's like, if you're starting a new podcast that was very like tech focused, you could be like, it's like Wire's Uncanny Valley, but with like a younger person angle, because it's clear like to us as a 4-person group that's been talking about the podcast for a while in some way or form, like what it is. But I think to a listener, it's still pretty abstract. So I'll give you guys all like a second to think about it, but at least like comparing it to, for me, a piece of content as a podcast that I really like admire is Honestly by Barry Weiss, and it's hosted by The Free Press, which is a company I also really admire. And I would say like, at least how I see this podcast is like Honestly, but like tech version, and like specifically young person version as well, because I think the goal of Honestly is to show like the private conversations happening and put it into public. And for us, I think we're kind of trying to achieve a similar thing, where you can read the headlines from Name Your Tech Source, you can like listen to other tech podcasts. But for us, these are for young professionals who are coming at this from like very different perspectives, who are trying to figure out like, what are you not seeing in the headlines, or what are you maybe forgetting about that literally happened like 6 months ago because something happened 3 months ago more recently. So that's how I would like position it in my content stream. It's just like, it's like Honestly, obviously we're not going to be interviewing experts, but we're still trying to get the same ethos of like showing what are the actual conversations happening around this for young professionals. Is anyone else?
I feel like I'm not going to have a good answer for this, because I truthfully don't really watch podcasts. So this is like based on one of the few, I'll just say like the Ezra Klein show, because it is one of the few podcasts I listen to, and I'll explain why I think that. I think for me, I'm a big fan of like co-creation. I love like the idea of like creating knowledge, bringing together like different perspectives. And as I understand, a lot of podcasts do that. So maybe this isn't unique, but again, my point of reference, where it's like I feel like I've really enjoyed talking to all of you, like as a group, but also individual context. I feel like we've had lots of really good conversations, bringing in like aspects of our expertise, but also like when we're together, we're sort of greater than the sum of our parts. And I kind of envision this podcast or whatever being that, basically, where it's like just us literally being in the same space, having this discourse and almost creating new forms of knowledge, creating new perspectives, ways of looking at things. And I cite the Ezra Klein show because I feel like it does a really good job of really highlighting and articulating perspectives that really bring together like different points of view. So I think that, or I hope that we can do that with this group.
Everyone?
Yeah, I think going back to what I said, it feels like our angle is different than the traditional podcasts I listen to, because, either we've talked about Dwarkesh Patel yesterday, which is like phenomenal podcast. He does a great job at really trying to bring these in-depth conversations by studying as much as he can. But at the end of the day, it's like I said, your takeaways are much more knowledge oriented and intellectual and theoretical than maybe necessarily knowing actually how to implement in your day to day, which is increasingly what people are being asked to do for AI, or it's increasingly being forced in your day to day, whether it's at work or whether it's through a business. Because of that, we're blending in much more of a conversational, casual, as you can see, standing around talking, not sitting back here. I'll stop.
And I guess the one creator I would I guess, reference for this is Ask ChatGPT. I think the thing I admire the most about her content is that she's just talking about AI as a user herself. And I think we all bring such unique and diverse backgrounds and experiences to the table. We're all working in different jobs right now, but recently graduated and are just trying to form an opinion around AI and try to figure out what we even think about it. I think that's really what we're hoping to bring to this podcast in helping viewers who are our age just trying to navigate this new technology that's really impacting our lives, just figure out how we should be thinking about it, using it, and navigating it and talking about it in these sorts of conversations.
So just to recap, the focus of why we're doing this podcast is to create an AI-focused piece of content that emphasizes the recent history of AI development. We want to be different by focusing on the timeline and evolution of AI rather than just the current releases and hype cycles or doom cycles from a young professional perspective. And I think at the end of the day, just make these topics about AI as accessible as possible to people who aren't deeply in the field but still get affected just the same. So let's put our money where our mouth is and talk about one specific timeline, ChatGPT. In case you live under a rock and you haven't heard about it at this point, it's pretty big in the world, and it's probably numbers wise and culturally the most popular AI model that we use. And it is created by a company with a very weird structure called OpenAI. Before November 2022, the team had been working on ChatGPT 1, ChatGPT 2, but it was really ChatGPT 3 in November 2022 that it blew up. It went supernova. And I was reading the release of it yesterday, and this is from November 30th, 2022. What struck me is that the messaging is so plain. It just starts with saying, we've trained a model called ChatGPT, which interacts in a conversational way, which might be the most like low-key introduction to such a game-changing piece of technology. And it goes on to say that the dialogue format makes it possible for chat to answer follow-up questions, admit its mistakes, challenge incorrect premises, and reject inappropriate requests. And we'll get to how newer models are talked about. And I think it's obviously there's still these like release pages, but it's talked about in much more grandiose ways. But I'll just finish with the last sentence here and then ask people what their thoughts were, where they were when this, looking back, pretty monumental moment happened. But this release ends by saying, we are excited to carry the lessons from this release into the deployment of more capable systems, just as earlier deployments informed this one. So it was never going to stop with GPT-3. And I think that really informs how we view the current progression as well. That's just a quick refresher, but anybody want to take a first stab at where they were when this came out? How long did it take for them to understand how to use it more, all of the memories. Austin, you have the mic, so go.
Yeah. I can speak for both me and Hillary a little bit in terms of, I know neither of us really used it when it first came out. I think we both saw it as, we're in school and we both valued learning a lot. And so we saw this, or at least maybe I should stop speaking for you. I saw it as something that I didn't need. That it was there, but it wasn't necessary because I had confidence in my own abilities. And I hadn't really explored it and explored its use potentials. So yeah, I just thought that I didn't need it. And I was also studied international history. So it wasn't like I needed it for coding or I needed it for math or something that's more straightforward, I would say, for a model. But then with me, it really blew up in terms of usage. Like I said earlier, at work, because my superior was very open to using it, especially because we had a lot of work. It was something that you could use to really hasten things along. So at first, like you said, I think everyone gets into ChatGPT. It's the most, I think, consumer friendly in a way in terms of it's literally just a chatbot you can chat with, anyone can chat with. And then very quickly, though, at that point, it's crazy to think about. But at that point, it was only trained on data up until a certain point. Maybe it was when it was released, but it didn't have web search abilities. It didn't have, it was not nearly as good as it is now. So then we moved on to Perplexity as well, which was ChatGPT, but added on. It was this kind of revolutionary of using it, but also using it to scrape the web and to find data points and to to really use it to search rather than use it as like a chat model. And I think it's just kind of blown up since then in terms of, other models coming out, in terms of capabilities coming out, in terms of new wraps. And I'm sure we'll get into all this, but yeah, really, I think it's crazy to think, going back to original release ChatGPT, how much it really has come since then.
Yeah, I feel like, well, one thing is, I wouldn't say that I had like one initial encounter with ChatGPT almost, because I feel like it came up at different points, just because it's like, it impacts like so many different parts of your life, right? So it came up in many different parts of my life. But like going back to the first instance I heard about it, I actually vividly remember I was like walking across the Key Bridge, which is this bridge between Georgetown and like Virginia, basically, and like it was very close to campus. I was just walking around with a friend, and then my friend was like, "Have you like used this like ChatGPT thing?" And I was like, I honestly, I'm not like a big like tech person, so like I kind of viewed it as this thing where it was like, oh, it's like this new website. New websites come out all the time, like doing interesting things. I'm not necessarily the most keen on adopting stuff like that, but yeah, he was telling me, he was like, oh yeah, like it's kind of cool. Like I was playing around with it. Again, like not really fully internalizing like what it would become over the next couple of years. But I wanted to bring this up because I think my initial sort of, I don't know if interaction is the right word with it, but like I think a big part of it was actually like play. Because we talk a lot about how like we use it for school, like we use it for work, and now it has these like very practical functions, right? But I think especially in the beginning when you're encountering this like really random like website that like suddenly everyone is talking about, right? Like it becomes like an entertainment source in some way or another, right? It's like, oh, like what can this do? Like, can I just like chat with it? Like, can I like actually have like and that's definitely new, right? Because normally you have conversations with people, but now you're like, oh, I can just like talk to like a chatbot, and like that's a very different experience from like talking to Siri, right? Or like talking to a chatbot like when you're like doing customer service stuff, right? So I think like that, and like if I were to really go back to it, it really comes down to this idea of like play and experimentation. And I think if we were, I don't know, I think that's what characterized it for me.
I mean, yeah, on that point, like I think another way to define play is like jailbreaking. Like you had people who got ChatGPT to just like produce infinite A's, like A. Like there was so many examples of just like prompts at the very beginning, and probably still now, where you can like jailbreak.
Wait, no idea. So, did you guys know about this?
They did. You're left out.
Okay, I clearly was not on my technology graph.
But I feel like that's a theme to this day that I think is very relevant. It's like, can you still make this AI model hallucinate? Can you still make it like break? Because that's what matters. Like that's how we can ultimately trust it. But that was just another way I was thinking about it when you said play.
Yeah, I think that was really interesting. Kind of similar experience with my first interaction with ChatGPT. I think in college someone was like, have you tried this thing? Exactly. And it was very much word of mouth. And I was like, no, I have no idea what this is. And when I first tried it, I was kind of like talking to it as if it was like Siri. And I remember when I was younger, people with Siri would try to get to like recite poems or like say something funny. And that was kind of the interaction I had with it. It was like, I don't know, saying all these, like I could get it to like write me a song about myself or like do all these like silly things. And I was like, oh, this is so fun. I think that was prior to when I actually realized like how useful it would be for using it for some of my classwork things. Like, oh my God, in my senior year, there was one part of this one course I had like 200 pages of reading to do a week. And my teacher was actually just like, yeah, if you can't get to all of these, just throw them into ChatGPT. It'll summarize it for you. And I was just like, wow, this is incredible. And then I started using it to help me fix bugs in my code for my senior thesis. Yeah, I think it was very much like a gradual progression from like hearing it word of mouth and then discovering new utilities for it. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
And I think, yeah, like, and that I would say like that definitely reflects my experience. I don't, maybe it resonates with all of you guys as well, where this idea of like going from experimentation and play to something a little more practical. But also I think something that's like relevant to emphasize here is like we were all like college kids at this point, right? Like we were all in school. And in that way, I also wonder like, was that a unique experience in some ways? Like the fact that we encountered this very transformative technology first through like play and experimentation. And it's also interesting too, because now when we think about like the benefits of AI, especially at like a societal scale. It's like, oh, it's going to like make businesses so much more efficient. Like it has all these like impacts on like the global economy, right? And like these are things that are very far from like people just playing around with things, right? So it's interesting to think about like this is like almost a generational experience in some ways, and to understand like really maybe they're actually very different ways that people encounter the technology, and like to what extent does that shape their current relationships with it. Just interesting to think about.
Let's move forward a couple of months now. So we're going from November 2022 to March 2023. It only takes a few months for OpenAI to release GPT-4. And just looking at the same format press release, it's way more engaging, it's way more interactive, it's way more business focused. Whereas when they were introducing ChatGPT-3, the team is just saying like, here it is. But they say GPT-4 is more creative and collaborative than ever before. It can generate, edit, and iterate with users on creative and technical writing tasks, such as composing songs, writing screenplays, or learning a user's writing style. So it's a lot more focused on a user's creativity in the different ways, like you mentioned. It also, I think for the first time, includes stats on how GPT is performing in a bar exam or biology Olympiad, which is increasingly becoming relevant, or calling into question the relevancy of those competitions for humans themselves. So fast forward a few months, maybe nothing has changed for you guys, but curious to know if with the new GPT-4 in March 2023, if that impacted you guys at all. I'll quickly just say that I feel like during that semester of spring 2023, some of the peers of me and Hillary, because we had the same major, like I was hearing more about how they were using it. And especially because we had a few pretty intense courses, like I think that's when I started using it more. So probably right after GPT-4 came out. And that was just to like help me brainstorm, help assemble lists. Me and Hillary did a project for the high-speed rail project in California, which one day, God willing, will be finished. And we used ChatGPT to like come up with the name of our hypothetical entity. So things like that where like it felt more real and like just more part of the work, but not like it was doing the work for us.
Yeah, I think I really like how you talked about it in terms of stumbling upon a website in terms of with ChatGPT 3, where like it reminds you of so many other websites that just does something. You're like, oh, I'm going to go on this, play around with it. You'll be in like Lao, which was the library, like just hanging out with friends. You just play around with it, see what it would do. Very creative. And then there does feel to be that jump, ChatGPT 4, like you said, in terms of the narrative, in terms of how they release it. And I think it feels like it's a lot to do with realizing the market and realizing really the consumer potential and stumbling onto what is like the next iPhone, the next big market. And so you see ChatGPT, it had the first movers advantage. It was the first to release a chatbot. But I think around this point, you were also getting Anthropic's Claude coming out. It was also when we're moving from this talking about, oh, this is an interesting concept, to AGI, to is this going to transform the world? Is this a race between the biggest companies? I think this was also the point that most people thought the US was just destined to dominate it. There wasn't even an idea. There wasn't even a hint of like DeepSeek, of any Chinese capabilities. No one was thinking about semiconductors going abroad. It was purely how fast is this going to evolve? And I think you can see that in the first or in the second release of ChatGPT 4, where it is much more aiming to capture that market share. It's much more trying to no longer just a technology, it's now a product. And they're really starting to emphasize it as being a product. And I think this is maybe where you see, I guess, like the first start or the first gunshot of the ongoing war for market share and for really diversifying brands.
Yeah, I think something I find really interesting about the origin story of OpenAI is how it started as a research lab, like a nonprofit generating research lab doing research on AI for the sake of learning more about what this technology could do. And I think like the release of ChatGPT was interesting because they had no idea that college students and people everywhere would find all these fun ways to use it. And I think that was the first time maybe like big organizations like OpenAI realized that AI could be consumer. It wasn't just something that would, help make us allow us to do calculations more quickly or help us determine the ways proteins fold. And I think for the first time, the market realized, wow, AI is something that people can have in their hands interact with on a daily basis. It's not just something that furthers the bounds of science or math. And I think like witnessing, that's exactly what we've been talking about, of how we witness that in real time and that realization kind of come about.
I think that's actually a really interesting way to put it, and like to sort of go into the theme, like the idea of like history, right? Because I think, so what I was going to say is, obviously we'd all heard about AI before ChatGPT. Like we knew it was like this big like tech thing. We knew it was going to transform things, right? And I would say like then it was talked about in pretty like a commercial sense, right? It was like, oh, like what sort of practical benefit will it have like for XYZ, like for the economy, for schools, for businesses, whatever, right? And in that way, that almost makes it seem like our experience with it initially was almost like a fluke in some ways. Like that was like an exception and like a type of disruption that people didn't expect. Because like I'd heard about AI conferences prior to ChatGPT. Like I knew it was happening behind the scenes, right? But somehow like it became this, it like went from being, you know, business focused. I mean, just as a proxy, but like especially like practically focused, to then like this weird like moment where people were experimenting with it and became like very consumer focused. And now we're almost seeing a shift back to the practical aspects of it. So it was interesting to like see that timeline charted in that way. That was just like a quick like digression off of your point. But one thing I was just gonna say is like, I don't know about you guys, but I did not know about like the versions of ChatGPT. First of all, I did not know that we started off with GPT-3. First, like you said that 1 and 2 were in development, but like, okay, I guess 3 was the first one they made public. I literally don't know. And I also
What's the first one they put out?
Okay, got it. Didn't know about GPT-4 really. I probably like came across it at some point, but like would not be able to like tell you the timeline for it. So like, and just like a quick poll, I guess, like, did you guys know that like when I noticed myself starting to use it more, like definitely like second semester, like which was around when GPT-4 came out, but like, did you guys know it was a new model? Like
I remember like the hype around it. I think that's what I was referencing when I felt like our peers are talking about it more, because I feel like when GPT-3 came out, I had similar reactions to others where it was like, okay, let's just kind of see what this is. And if it's not going to like immediately impact my chances of success as a student, like there's so many other things going on in college where I just didn't really think about it. But yeah, I remember like GPT-4 being hyped in a way that GPT-5 got hyped, and I'm sure GPT-6 and 7 and however many more. And of course, there's always going to be a gap between like the expectation and reality. But I do remember like that month of March, especially because I had just come back from a tech conference in SF. So it's probably front of mind. But I was like, oh, like this like could be something big. So at least I remember being pretty aware of it.
You know, to be honest, I did not. Like, I knew it had released in terms of ChatGPT 4, but like I said, did not care, was not really part of my life. I think the most I knew or heard about AI was actually Claude, in terms of one of my roommates was in CS and he had, no, actually it was ChatGPT, but he had a subscription, because the idea of that was crazy at the start of having a subscription to ChatGPT, but it really was for him to unlock, I'm not going to say didn't want to do his work, but to unlock a tutor, a helper. But for this whole bit, I really never used AI. And so it is interesting to look back. And I guess this is a note for myself, but I want to be careful not to impose or reimpose an understanding of AI if we're like trying to do this historically through this, because I at least had at this point like no idea of, I knew it was something. I knew people were using it for stuff, but I think in my head, even though the broader market realized it was probably more consumer than they once thought, I don't think it had nearly reached that actual point. I think there was some use cases, depending on how you want to use it, but you know, it'd still hallucinate probably a lot more than it does now. And I think the biggest use case was definitely CS compared to anything else. So I think in my eyes, where it really started picking off, for me at least, was once it started having wraps, which a wrap is when a company builds a new use case around an existing model, say ChatGPT, because we have a little background noise. Yeah, it's snapping. Because I think at that point, when there were more wraps, that's when you really see the market kicking in terms of commoditizing it, in terms of making it more consumer. Because there's people who didn't work on it. These are not researchers. These are people who see this and recognize the market potential. And so the biggest one, I think, was Perplexity. It was, like I said, saw that, okay, this is a really cool thing in terms of having a chat bot that you can go back and forth with. But what if we build that into searching? So if you want to look up something, you can completely bypass Google. And so yeah, for me, that was my first interaction, because I think to me, that was when it really started clicking in terms of becoming more than a toy. Not saying it was a toy before, but I think Wraps and Perplexity was when, both people first started commoditizing it. But then I think these AI companies saw it and like, we can do that. We can include that. So it's really began that race towards commoditization.
To close out the timeline for today, I want to reference a piece that OpenAI CEO Sam Altman wrote in his blog in June of this year. He titles it The Gentle Singularity. I think this is his latest blog. And he talks about how, in some big sense, ChatGPT is already more powerful than any human who's ever lived. Hundreds of millions of people rely on it every day and for increasingly important tasks. A small new capability can create a hugely positive impact. A small misalignment multiplied by hundreds of millions of people can cause a great deal of negative impact. I don't really want to get into GPT-5 today because it is so new, and I think it honestly would be more befitting of a future episode. So instead, I want to close by asking you guys what that sentiment means to you. What is your version of a world where AI is able to do more good than harm? And then the reverse, AI applies itself to so many different disciplines. So what are you personally tracking in that regard?
I think for me, at least, I think it's really interesting that we see these AI CEOs are basically like Renaissance men, and that they love their blog posts. They love their blog posts, and they love writing about it, because I think at, their deepest core, these were researchers. They're nerds. They love geeking out about it. And what this reminds me of is Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic. He also releases blog posts, and he released one called Machines of Love and Grace, or Loving Grace, one of those two. And basically in it, he talks about how his gut reaction is not to overhype or to talk about the good possibilities of AI. Because one, he doesn't want to be just another person who's promising too much. But also he thinks there are real risks, like you talked about, in terms of misalignment, which is, when AI thinks it's okay to lie, what happens then? So, but in this blog post, he's like, for this one, I don't think people quite realize how good it can be. So in it, he goes into, these ideas of AI being able to create biological freedom, where you're able to change any part of your being, really, because of AI unlocking the secrets of the human genome, which it did. And, it goes into much more in terms of its capabilities, but he at the same time acknowledges a lot of potential harm, because at the end of the day, there is the worry about misalignment, about the AI itself being wrong, but he also acknowledges it's a tool at the end of the day. A high possibility that this becomes just another thing that, boosts certain economies, is kind of kept out of other economies, or isn't as widely spread because of either digital infrastructure gaps, or, a lot to break down there. But yeah, I think it's something that you always have to be careful about in terms of balancing that AI hype, because AI CEOs are obviously the ones who are most profiting off of selling AI hype, but it is really real, but also is, I guess, the danger.
Well, what's your vision of what good?
Yeah, no, that was I didn't really say much. I think in my head, how I see it, AI is I think it can be defined by freedom. And maybe that's just me as an American speaking, but I see it as, in a way, very dangerous freedom. Because I've likened it to, I think, the Industrial Revolution, in which you saw the Industrial Revolution before. It was a lot of, handmade crafts, or, it's very individualized artisanal creation. And you don't want to overemphasize that or kind of romanticize it. But during the Industrial Revolution, people figured out how to manufacture productivity to make things, which, people have done throughout history, but this was on a mass scale. And what you saw was you could replace humans. You could create a machine that does something. And that was always a thing, whether it's like a water wheel or something. but you did this on a mass scale that it had such societal ramifications. And I think if you look at short term, there was a lot of horrendous stuff that happens. They're the Luddites for good reason, because these machines were like chewing up children, chewing up people, putting people out of jobs, and the government was not nearly doing anything that they should be doing. And I think, but long term, what we see is everyone has shoes, everyone has clothes, because, you can mass produce it. And so it's cheaper, and, you don't have to go get specifically tailored for a person. And I think I see that similar for AI, which is another industrial revolution, but instead of blue collar jobs, it will be white collar jobs, where you're industrializing intelligence. As it says, you're creating intelligence, you're creating the ability to write, you're creating the ability to be creative in some ways, which has always been this very privileged and, artificially upheld industry, because the idea is, oh, you have to learn to do this, or you have to go to school, or it's what the literati does. So I think what we'll see is, what essentially I'm getting at, is whether in the long run this produces the freedom of the Industrial Revolution, where you don't need a very long supply chain of people working to produce one shoe, or whether, this puts a bunch of people out of jobs, and, government doesn't really follow up.
Yeah, I guess the thing I'm most excited about when it comes to AI is the fact that it has the potential to be such an equalizer. If you think about the thousands of dollars that goes into tutoring, and the fact that you can have a tutor available at any hour of any day for any student, I think that's such an incredible value. I think I am really worried about AI alignment. I did an AI safety fellowship at Cambridge, and yeah, for every 100,000 AI researchers, there's only one AI safety researcher. And I think that's really telling about our values when it comes to like what we're prioritizing at this point in AI development. But it's also really scary to think that we're just developing AI at breakneck speed, but not thinking about the potential ramifications of what we're actually building. So I'm hoping to maybe break this down a bit more in future episodes.
I think high level, what's good about AI, which is like in some ways a summary of what we've said, is like it democratizes access to a lot of things. I think it creates a fundamentally new experience, a new way of living. And the downside of it is that instead of viewing this new experience as something that adds on to existing experience, I think there's a tendency to view it as replacing existing experiences. In a nutshell, I think if I could like briefly digress, I think an analogy that's coming up as you guys are both talking actually is like, I'm kind of almost viewing AI as like the thing that's like promoting like generic versions of things, right? Where it's like, you have the example of the artisan versus like mass manufacturing. I think the example that comes to mind, because I'm interested in this field, is like fast fashion. And I know like fast fashion is like a very controversial subject for like the environmental, sort of social, like ESG, right? Like there are a whole host of like environmental, social governance issues around fast fashion. The idea though is that like what I like about it is that it really democratizes access to fashion, right? But like what you see of it is that it's like cheap, right? It tends not to be very sustainable. It's not high quality, right? And like, again, whole host of issues, right? Like the workers who are producing it, like the environmental costs of like the water and stuff like that. But I think it really does come down to a trade-off. Right? It comes down to like, it's interesting too. It's like almost a trade-off, I think, of this experiential aspect of it, which is like this freedom, right? And I think we see it with AI too. Like I think the benefit of AI is like the freedom it confers. But I think really the harms of it are also like on the flip side are like very practical and very real, but maybe invisibilized, right? Like the water, like the workers, and like that you have literally similar parallels with AI, exactly, right? So it's just, I don't know, maybe a helpful analogy for people who are interested in that. But
I'll say that I'm most excited to see how AI transforms the American healthcare sector. I think that what I've seen from people in my life who are in the medical profession is just like extreme burnout, and even the ones who have a good like I think it's a very different definition of that. And both in terms of how AI has already started like really speeding up the administrative process, but also like the way that it could potentially like really individualize your health. So like when you have an issue like the chances of like the doctor correctly diagnosing you on the first try, like no matter who you are, because definitely some groups get more misdiagnosed than others, like will hopefully rapidly increase. And then I would love to see that expand to figuring out our insurance systems and companies, because as young professionals, that's something that it's just kind of handed to you, like choose your plan. And you're like, what does that even mean? Like even someone like me who I'm lucky where like I have parents, I have an older sister who can like help me walk through. I'm still very confused. Like, how do I make sure I'm like actually using this plan that is part of like taking my paycheck, but it's also like giving me a lot of benefits. Like what do I do with that? So I'd love AI just like fix all of that if possible. And then I would actually say, I think I run counter to you, Austin, on the creativity point. I don't love the fact that we have so much more AI slop on the internet and tech. And I get it. Like I get that that's going to be part of their transition. Like there is going to be a lot more just objectively like mediocre stuff out there as people figure out how good the technology can get. So while I understand that's part of the process, I worry that for our generation, people younger who like do not have the brain capabilities to understand like the time it does take to learn something. And again, like I hear everybody on like the democratization point. It's content is definitely something, or like creativity, that like needs to be disciplined and practiced, in my opinion. Like you only get better by continuing to do it. Like I think we're pretty past the myth of just like you need one viral post and like you're fine forever. You get like these brand sponsorships and like you're set. It's a lot of work, and I'm glad that AI can help with that, but I also just worry because content creation is such a young person's game. I know that's changing as the industry evolves, but that's the perception, at least. I mean, look at the Time 100 creators list. So I think I do worry about that. I worry how much of a cost it is, especially for young people to like grow up knowing like AI generated art or content that might not be that good and just kind of accepting that as a norm. Hopefully they don't, but that is a concern I do have. All right, I think we can close out on the first episode. That concludes episode 1 of Accessible Intelligence. I hope you guys had as much fun listening and watching as we did recording. If you like what you heard or saw, make sure to subscribe to the Mindful Notion Substack. We'll be posting 4 more episodes of this series over the next 8 or so weeks. You're not going to want to miss out. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, feel free to leave a rating or review. It helps attract new listeners. And if you're watching on Substack, consider recommending us as well, because that creates a really helpful symbiotic relationship of attention gaining. And yeah, we just want to keep giving it just a really realistic perspective, at least from a young professional lens, of how AI is evolving, and can't wait for more. We'll see you for the next episode.